Okay, tonight what we're going to be covering is Lesson 2 and Lesson 3. And Lesson 2 is going to cover property management and then Title 32, Chapter 20, Article 3.1. Now those articles, you guys, that law exam that I was telling you guys about, that outside assignment that you'll have, that's going to cover all of the law articles, okay? Now, this is the shortest article in the law book is Article 3.1. So everything in those articles, and after the midterm, I'll show you how to access the law book. We'll go through it. But what I did is I went through those articles and I pulled out the stuff that I felt was the most important for the state exam, and that's what you're going to find in your book. So you don't have to actually go into the law book and go through Article 3.1 in order to get all the material for the quiz or the midterm, okay? So all of the questions for the quizzes and the exams come right out of the book. So any of the external articles that we'll use from the law book after the midterm, all that stuff we're going to go through them, but all the material that's in your book is what you guys will be responsible for. So the first part of the lesson gets in and it talks about property management. And remember from REA179 we said, do you remember what the licensing requirement is in Arizona for property management? Do you need a real estate license? That's right. If it's 2 or more properties for someone else during a 24-hour period, and if you're being compensated, that's when you would need a license. So if you were going to manage this apartment complex, and that apartment complex had 100 units, and it had one address, and it was conveyed to the owner with one deed, would you need a real estate license to manage those units? No, because it's only one property. But if you managed these 2 single-family detached homes, and they each had their own separate address, and they were conveyed to the owner with a separate deed, if you're being compensated, would you need a license to manage those? Yes, you would. You would need a license to manage those. So remember, that's the Arizona licensing requirement. If it's 2 or more properties for someone else during a 24-hour period, and if you're being compensated, and that compensation could be a commission, it could be a salary, it could be a bonus, it could be a bonus based on a commission. Any sort of compensation that you're receiving for managing those, if it's 2 or more for somebody else in a 24-hour period, that's when a real estate license would be required.
Even if they gave you something like a car?
Well, that would be compensation. Yeah, that would be compensation, even though it's personal property, just like cash is, but it would still be compensation. And the department looks at that. If it's compensation, you would need a license. The exceptions, remember, any person dealing with their own property. So if you had 20 of your own rental properties in your portfolio, could you manage those for your own behalf and not need a license? Sure, because you're not managing them for someone else and you're not being compensated for it. B, finder's fees to an unlicensed person who is a tenant in an apartment complex managed by the firm or owned by the owner. So if you were managing that apartment complex right there, could you send out a notice to all of your tenants in the complex that said, if you refer us a tenant, we will give you a finder's fee? Yes. We are on page 97. So could you give a referral fee to somebody if they brought you a new tenant? Yes, but could you give them cash? So if you had a tenant that said, okay, I'm going to refer a friend to you guys, and your friend ended up writing a lease, could that property manager or owner give you a cash referral? Now, what are they giving you if they give you that cash? They're paying you a commission, aren't they? And what are the 2 things you need to earn a commission? You must be licensed and employed by a broker. Now, how could they do the same thing and get away with it? Well, they could pay that finder's fee as a credit towards your rent, okay? Now, the maximum finder's fee that can be paid to any person that sends them a referral is $200, and you can't get that $200 any more than 5 times during a 12-month period. So, for one person. So, how many referral fees could you get as a tenant if you lived in this apartment complex in a 12-month period? 5. So, what would be the maximum amount that you could get? $1,000. But can that be in the form of cash or check or a gift card? No, it would have to be in a credit or reduction in your rent. We're just talking about what happens here. Other states might be different. They might allow for cash payments or things like gift cards and things, but not here. Property managers act in a general agency capacity. Now, for those of you guys that have had 179 already, and for those of you that haven't, we will go over this. When a broker is involved in a transaction, and we're going to use the seller as our client, when we're looking at agency relationships, if the broker is empowered to act on the principal's behalf, and in this example, the principal is going to be the seller, okay? Remember from 179, you guys, what type of agency capacity does that broker act in? I know there's only been a few of you guys that have taken 179 already, but, well, it's called single or special agency, because single agency means that when the principal is empowering the agent to act on their behalf, they're empowering them to act on their behalf to do one specific thing, either help them sell, or if they were representing them as a buyer's broker, to help them buy, okay? So the broker's only empowered to do one specific thing, and again, we call that special or single agency. And you don't need to write any of that down because you will go over that in 179. Now, the subagent for the broker, though, or a broker acting as a property manager, they don't act in one capacity. They could do more than one thing. So could this broker, if they're acting as a property manager for the seller, could they lease the units in that seller's apartment complex? Yeah, they could do that. Could the broker handle all the administrative responsibilities for that apartment complex? Yeah, they could do that. Could they handle all the maintenance responsibilities of that apartment complex? Yeah, they could do that too. So you could see that, can they act in more than one capacity? They can, and that's what general agency is referring to. General means you could do more than one thing. Single or special agency means you could only do one thing. And then that designation we talked about before, that CPM, remember what that stands for? Certified Property Manager, that's right. And that's a designation that you could earn through the Institute of Real Estate Management, which is part of the National Association of Realtors. But this is a good designation, you guys, to get if you are a property manager.
Do you have to get it to be a property manager, or is it
No, you don't need it. It's just an it's just additional education hours that you're taking to further your position as a property manager. So just like as a real estate licensee, you could get that realtor designation, you could get CRS, GRI, EPRO. I mean, I think the last time I checked, we have 24 or 25 different designations that we could get. And again, remember, those designations are just additional education hours that you take. And as you're taking those are all practical hours. They're relevant practical hours that you're taking. And you could take that material that you learned from that class and you could apply it to your business right away to help make your business better. And that's what the CPM designation would allow you to do. So it's just additional education that you take as a property manager. And again, once you have that designation, you have it forever, or as long as you're a member of the association. Now, the first article that we're going to go over, Title 32, Chapter 20, Article 3.1. Now, these statute numbers, you guys, you don't need to know what those statute numbers are. So you see the first one, 322173. You don't need to know that statute number. That's just, I wanted to put those in there so that you guys could reference those statutes if you wanted to look this stuff up in the law book, okay? So Title 32, Chapter 20, Article 3.1 is the article on property management, and the first article, 322173, specifically talks about property management agreements. And does anybody know what a property management agreement is? It's an employment agreement between the property manager and the owner, okay? So if the broker here is also a property manager and the well, instead of seller, let's put owner. If the property owner is employing the broker as their property manager, what type of an employment agreement are they going to have? So, and that employment agreement that they have is called a property management agreement. What types of things might be in that property management agreement? Yeah, so what kind of fee is the property manager going to be charging the owner every month to manage that property? That would be in that property management agreement. What else do you think might be in there? Yeah, a starting and end date is really important. So when is that employment agreement going to start and when is that employment agreement going to end? What else do you think might be in there? Okay, there's sure, that's a provision that might be in that property management agreement. What else?
Personal information of the owner, like account to deposit the money.
Yeah, that could be in there. So if the owner says, well, as you as the property manager, when you're collecting the rents, this is the account that I want those rent monies to go into, they could identify that account in the property management agreement. Anything else that you might think of? Yeah, the rights and responsibilities. What is the property manager going to be responsible for? What is the property owner going to be responsible for? How often do the property managers have to report back to the property owner? And what type of reports? So when we talk about reports, what type of reports do you think might be maybe maintenance reports? What's that? Okay, or accounting. Okay, which would include things like a balance sheet, a profit and loss statement, a cash flow statement. Anything else? How about vacancy reports? Vacancy. How about things like maintenance reports? Okay. The what? Oh, sorry. That's why you don't drink before class. Anything else you could think of?
Anything that's special or extraordinary that happened, like in a
The what? Okay.
or HOA regulation rule.
Yeah, things like CC&Rs. Okay. So how often is the property manager going to have to report back to the property owner on these types of issues? Those are the types of things, you guys, that you're going to find in that property management agreement. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sometimes I've seen them as owner agreements. Most of the time you'll just see it as a property management agreement because it's the employment agreement between those two parties. Now, can each party negotiate any terms or conditions of that employment agreement? Sure. So if the property manager says, well, I'm only going to report back to you on these issues quarterly, could the owner say, well, quarterly isn't going to be enough. I need those reports every month, or I need them biweekly, or I need them semi-annually, however often that they want those. They could negotiate any of those terms or conditions of that employment agreement. The property management agreement, it must be written in clear, unambiguous language. 2, it must state all material terms and conditions of the property management firm's services, obligations, duties, and responsibilities back to the property owner. And those could be pretty extensive as far as what is the property manager's responsibility, especially if they're doing more than one thing. So if they're handling all the leasing, the administration, all the maintenance of that apartment complex, that could be pretty extensive as far as what their duties and responsibilities are. Yeah, taxes. 3, cancellation terms must be mutually agreed upon, because remember we said this property management agreement, it's going to have a commencement date and it's going to have an expiration date. Okay? So if that commenced on 1/1 of 2017 and it expired at 12/31/2017, that would be a 1-year property management agreement. Now, what if that was a 2-year property management agreement? Then whatever the parties agree to. Now, cancellation provisions, you guys, have to be mutually agreed upon. So somewhere in that property management agreement, they have to outline what are going to be the cancellation provisions. So what if the property owner says, you know what, I just don't think I'm getting along with that property manager and they're really not doing what I need them to do. I want to cancel that agreement. Those cancellation provisions have to be mutually agreed upon. Same thing with the property manager. If the property manager said, hey, you know what, I just don't think that I could work with this property owner. I don't feel that they are ethical in the way that they do business, and it's contrary to the way that I do business according to my values. I want to cancel that agreement. Those cancellation provisions have to be mutually agreed upon. Number 4, it must be signed by the property owner or their agent and the property management firm's designated broker or their representative. 5, we mentioned, specify the type and frequency of status reports to the owner. You must specify a beginning and ending date. 7, provide for the disposition and allocation of interest earned on trust accounts. Now, as a property manager, you guys, all property managers are going to have something called a trust account, or they might have multiple trust accounts, okay? And does anybody know what a trust account is? It could be. It could be.
It's money that is collected from tenants or other business entities, contractors that have done services that get deposited for accountability.
Yeah, it could be that too. It's an account designed to hold someone else's money. So as a property manager, if you set up a trust account, that trust account is going to be, you deposit money into that trust account, but you're holding it for somebody else. So if it's a trust account, if the property manager has $25,000 worth of security deposits in that trust account, does that $25,000 belong to the property manager? No, it belongs to somebody else. They're just holding it in trust for somebody else. So typically that would be for the property owner, okay? So do you think that the property manager has the right to spend or use that money? No, because it doesn't belong to them. And at some point during the class, I'll show you on the Department of Real Estate's website, there's something that's called the Real Estate Bulletin, and that comes out every quarter. And in that bulletin, there's a section called the Disciplinary Action section. And in that Disciplinary Action section, you could look and see all the licensees that have had their license revoked or suspended. And normally when you go down that list and you look at the licenses that have been revoked or they've had large fines imposed on them by the Department of Real Estate, it has to do with this right here. Property managers that spend the trust money, because does that money belong to them? No. And you'd be surprised that the amounts of some of the trust account deficiencies by property managers. And our current real estate commissioner, Judy Lowe, she took office in 2009. And one of the things that she has done in our industry is to crack down on property managers that spend trust money. Because we said, does that trust money belong to them? No, it doesn't. So there's auditing requirements that the Department of Real Estate requires for every broker that has a trust account. So you have to send those reports to the Department of Real Estate, and if there's ever any discrepancies in the amount that's in there versus what you should have, and the department audits your records, that's one way for a property manager to lose their license really quick. Now, on these trust accounts, you guys, they're typically interest bearing. Okay? So who gets all the interest money on those trust accounts? Because remember, does that money that's in that trust account, does that belong to the property manager? No, but it's their account, so who gets the interest money on those trust accounts? That would be something that you would have to work out in that property management agreement, is who's going to get the interest monies that are in those trust accounts. Does it belong to the owner? Is that interest going to go to the property manager? Is it going to go to the tenants? If there's things like security deposits that are being deposited into that trust account. So, and there's a maximum amount, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, a maximum amount of the broker's own money that could be in that trust account, and the maximum is $3,000. So if the broker has any more than $3,000 of their own personal funds in that trust account, we call that commingling, okay? And that's one of the things that the Department of Real Estate does not like. And why do you think that they wouldn't like for a broker to have more than this of their own money in that trust account? It's too easy to mix those two up. Or could it be very tempting for a broker if they said, hey, you know what? I only have $3,000 of my own money in that trust account, and my operating expenses are a lot more than that this month, and I could go in, I could borrow the money from that trust account, and then I'll pay it back next month when I have more revenue. That would be in violation of the commissioner's rules, because that money does not belong to the property manager or broker. That belongs to whoever they're holding it in trust for. Their own personal funds, if they have $3,000 in there, that's the maximum amount that they could take out of there. And if they're able to show things like deposits and withdrawals that they take out of there for not only their own personal funds, but also for whoever that account is, who they're holding that account money for. 322174, property management accounts. All property management accounts shall be designated as trust accounts. And again, a trust account, you guys, is designed to hold whose money? Someone else's. So if the broker has this trust account as ABC Realty trust account, okay, if they're depositing security deposits for the tenants into that trust account, who do those security deposits belong to? They belong to the tenants, okay? So they'd be holding them in trust for the tenants until that lease agreement expires, okay? Or if they skip out on their lease, what is in that property management agreement, what are they supposed to do with those monies, with those security deposits? So that's one thing that you'll also want to have outlined in that property management agreement is, what do they do with security deposits once those leases expire? Number 2, the broker shall not have access to the owner's personal accounts. Now, the only way that the property manager, you guys, or broker is going to have access to the owner's personal accounts is if the owner gives them permission in that property management agreement. Now, what do you think might be an example of when the property manager might have access to the owner's personal account?
Maybe when an owner draws and the management company sends the money for rent to the owner.
There you go. That's a good example right there. That came from a true property manager right there.
What about dispersing security deposits?
So they're going back, but remember who those monies going back to typically.
But can the property, it doesn't have to be the owner, it could be
Well, what if some of those security deposits are retained by the owner? So if that was the case, then the property manager agreement would say if the owner retains any of those security deposits, where are those monies going to go? Are they going to go to the owner's personal account? And if so, does the property manager have the authority to deposit those funds in that account? Number 3, signers on a trust account may be either a licensee or an unlicensed natural person employed by the broker. Now, a natural person, you guys, that's just a individual and not a entity. And remember, an entity would be a company, okay? So when you see that term in the law articles where it says a natural person, that's just a physical person and not an entity. So who could sign these trust accounts? Who could be a signer on those trust accounts? It could be any natural person or any physical person that works for the broker, and it could be either somebody that's a licensee or somebody that is not licensed that works for that broker. So it could be a licensee, it could be somebody that doesn't have a license, just somebody that is employed by the broker.
Do they have to be approved and by the broker? Like they have to be approved by the broker in order to do that?
When you say approved,
I don't know, like approved to sign a check. Like me and my husband are approved to sign our check, but my mom couldn't sign it. Does that make sense?
well, I mean, because you like yours because you and your husband are the only names on that account, right? Well, there would have to be a signature card on file for that account, because if that account was under the name of ABC Realty, who's a designated signer on behalf of ABC for that account? So the broker would have to have a signature card on file with the bank to show who has authority to sign on that account. Number 4, any monies received that are not subject to dispute must be deposited within 3 business days. So any funds, you guys, that the broker receives or property manager receives that are going into that trust account, they have to go in there within 3 business days of when they receive them, unless that money is subject to some dispute. And what do you think might be a dispute that where the money might not go into that trust account within 3 business days? Yeah, maybe maintenance issues. Anything else you could think of? What if a tenant gave a post-dated check to the property manager and said, here's a deposit check, but I don't get paid until next week. Can you hold this post-dated check until then? That would be an example of when they wouldn't have to do that within 3 business days. Commingling, when the broker has more than $3,000 of their own personal funds in that account right there. Now, why do you think a broker would even have $3,000 of their own dollars in that account? Possibly. There might be a minimum balance that their financial institution requires that they keep in there. And it used to be, a few years ago, the maximum amount was only $500, but now and I think that was about 4 or 5 years ago. It's been raised now to $3,000, and from what I'm hearing down at the department, that may go up again in the future. So what do you think might be something that an owner might use that for, other than a minimum balance? That normally would come out of an operating account, but maybe.
What about supplying the licenses for the realtors that work for them as well? Would that come out?
That could be if they were paying for that, yeah. Or if there was what if in one of their owner's accounts that the owner didn't have enough to cover a repair? What if one of their accounts the owner only had $2,000 in repair reserve money, and there was a repair that was greater than $2,000? Could they possibly use that to cover it and have the owner reimburse them for that? I know when last year when I was teaching the broker class out in Yuma, one of the property managers that was taking the class said, oh yeah, that's why we always keep $3,000 always at that amount in that account, because when owners, because they manage properties for a lot of out-of-state and out-of-country owners, and if the owners don't have enough in their account to cover certain expenses, that's where they'll pull the money from.
So if the interest is higher than 3,000 for the broker, do they have to take that money?
They would have to take it out. So what if the interest money that was accumulating on that account, because what if this was a large trust account? Let's say that instead of 25,000, they had 250,000 worth of monies in that account. That interest could accumulate pretty quick. So if that interest is being deposited into that account, that broker better make sure that they keep a record of that to make sure that they don't exceed that $3,000 limit, because if they do, that's considered commingling, and they could get fined by the Department of Real Estate for that.
Would they lose that money? That was the interest, but they just didn't quite catch?
No, they wouldn't lose it. I think if I was going to set up a trust account like this, I think what I would do is I would notify the bank and say, look, any interest money on this account, it does not go back into there. It goes into a separate account. Because that way you don't have to worry about, well, how much interest is being deposited in there every month. Conversion, that's spending the trust money. So that's one way, you guys, for a property manager or broker to lose their license, is by spending that money that's in that trust account. Because remember, who does that money belong to? Does it belong to the broker or property manager? No, it belongs to whoever deposited that money in there. 322175, record keeping. Property management firms must keep residential rental agreements for 1 year from the expiration of the rental agreement, and the record shall be kept at the broker's office or at an off-site storage location. If you have a highlighter, you guys, one tip I could give you, anytime in these law articles when we go over them, if you see anything that's dealing with a date, a time frame, or a dollar amount, highlight those, because it's probably pretty important. Like with the trust account, what's the maximum amount that a broker could keep in there? $3,000. That's something that you should probably highlight. That's important. So property management firms, they have to keep residential rental agreements for 1 year after they have, once that lease has been completed, okay? Or if that lease is expired, they have to keep a physical record for 1 year, and they have to keep that physical record either at the property management office or at some off-site storage location. Property management firms must keep records for all finder's fees paid to tenants for 3 years after payment. So they only have to keep records of leases for 1 year after that lease agreement has been completed, but they have to keep records for finder's fees for up to 3 years. And remember, what's the maximum amount that they could pay somebody for those finder's fees? $200 each time, and how many times per year? No more than 5. Fiduciary responsibility. Now, when we go over agency, you guys, in 179, you'll see that once a broker creates agency, it's really no different creating agency as a property manager than it is if you're representing either the seller or the buyer, okay? It's just you're going to be acting in a different agency capacity, because remember we said if the broker is representing either a buyer or a seller, they're acting in a single agency capacity, which means that they can only do one thing, help them sell or help them buy. But if you're a property manager, you're acting in a general agency capacity, and you could do more than one thing. But once you create agency with in this case, the property owner, that means that the property owner is empowering the broker and property manager to act on their behalf. And they're going to act on their behalf in a general agency capacity, which means that they could do, we said, they could do more than one thing. So they could lease all the units. They could handle all the administrative duties. They could handle all the maintenance of the apartment complex. So they could do more than one thing. So once you create agency, then you're going to owe your client the 5 fiduciary responsibilities. And does anybody know what fiduciary means? Well, you have to put your client's best interest above all others, including your own self-interest, okay? So once you've created agency with your client, or once you've created agency and they've become a client, then you owe your client the 5 fiduciary responsibilities of care, obedience, accountability, loyalty, and disclosure. Now, I know there isn't a lot of you guys that have already taken 179, but we'll go over these fiduciary responsibilities in Lesson 4, so you don't have to write any of these down that I'm going to go over. But the first one, the fiduciary responsibility of care, that means that you're going to be put in a position of honesty and trust, and you have to put your client's best interest above all others, and you also are going to be held to a higher standard, okay? So when we say you're going to be held to a higher standard, you as a broker or property manager, you have a professional license, and since you have that professional license, you're going to be held to a higher standard than somebody that does not have a professional license. Obedience, that means you have to obey the instructions of the principal as long as they're legal and ethical. Accountability, that means that you're going to be accountable for things like funds and paperwork back to the owner. Loyalty. Loyalty means, again, that you have to put your client's best interest above all others, including your own self-interest. And there's certain things that the property owner might share with you as the property manager that you would have to keep confidential. And then disclosure or notice. Now that means that there's certain things, you guys, as a property manager, even if the seller shares certain information with you in confidence, you would still be required to disclose that to a prospective tenant. And what do you think might be an example of information that the property owner might share with the property manager, even though they share it in confidence, that the property manager would still have to disclose to a prospective tenant? Location. The what? Location of? No, they wouldn't have to disclose that.
Anything that would be considered harmful or illegal.
Anything that is material, okay? And material is something that could influence another party's decision, okay? So anything that could influence a tenant's decision, that property manager should share that information with the tenant, even if the property owner said, I'm telling you or I'm sharing this information with you in confidence. And what do you think might be an example of that? Yeah. What if the owner knew that there was a water leak, and that water leak was repaired, but all that water damage, now there's mold in the walls. You can't see it, but it's behind the walls. If the owner said, well, I'm telling you this because I want to share that with you in confidence. I don't want you to share that with any prospective tenants. Should you, as the property manager, inform a tenant about that? Yeah, that's material. That's something that could influence their decision. Anything else that you might think of? What's that? Lead-based paint. If the property owner is aware that the property contains lead-based paint and they share that with you in confidence, you would be required to disclose that. That's part, Patrick, that's part of Arizona's, what we call it, the stigmatized property law, and we'll talk about that It could. It's just like if the property was the site of a natural death, homicide, suicide, if there was a felony committed, if the property was possessed by spirits. I know everybody laughs about that one, but no, you don't have. If there was a crime that was committed on the premises, you don't have to disclose it. If there was a crime committed against the premises, then you would have to disclose that. So if you had a tenant that was dealing drugs out of there and they got arrested, would you have to disclose that? No, you wouldn't. If there was a tenant that died in one of those units, would you have to disclose that? No, because that's covered under Arizona's stigmatized property law, and we'll talk about that in lesson 4 in REA 179. That too is covered under stigmatized property law. So if you knew that there was 2 registered sex offenders that lived in your apartment complex, if there was a family that came in and said, hey, is there any sex offenders that live in the area? Would you have to disclose that? You don't, because that too is covered under stigmatized property law. I don't agree with some of the things in stigmatized property law. I understand why we have it, because if, let's say, instead of this being a rental property, well, let's say that it was a rental property, but it was a single-family home. And let's say that there was a murder inside that home. Could that not only stigmatize that property, but that neighborhood? It sure could. And that's why I understand the stigmatized property law. I don't always agree with all the areas or of what it includes, because I think that some of that stuff, all that is material, and I think some of that should be disclosed.
So what if a tenant does their due diligence and they find out that that's happened?
It's all public record.
Yeah, it's all that.
I'm saying, so if it's public,
Yep.
do they have a way out then?
Well, they have the right not to sign the contract.
Yeah, I mean, before they enter into that agreement, yes. So if they said, hey, I'm thinking about renting that house that you're managing, and before I sign that lease agreement, I want to check to see if there's any sex offenders that live in that area, and you did your due diligence and you went to ArizonaSexOffender.org and you typed in that zip code and found out that there's a halfway house across the street for registered sex offenders, could you say, well, you know what? No, I don't think I want to sign that rental agreement. Yeah, that's why it is. And we have something that we give to anybody that we're helping, a tenant that we're helping find a property for, called a tenant advisory, which gives them, it's 12 pages of website information of where they could do their due diligence for things like that. Property managers can't make a secret profit from the owner. Because remember we said, you guys, as a fiduciary, whose responsibility do you have to look out for as the property manager? You have to look out for the owners. You have to look out for your client's best interest. So making a secret profit on the owner that's not disclosed in that property management agreement, you'd be violating your fiduciary responsibility of loyalty.
Does the owner's fiduciary responsibility, does that trump the tenant? If it was like one or the other?
You mean what the property manager's responsibility is to the tenant versus the owner?
Right. Like, is there one that kind of trumps, okay, I need to choose the owner because...
Well, they might not have, the property manager might not have a fiduciary responsibility to the tenants. They might not be representing them. And an example of that, how many of you guys have ever gone into a new home subdivision before? Yeah, what's the sign that you always see at the very front when you walk in a new home subdivision? If you have a realtor, they must accompany you on the first visit, because that is your representation. And if you come into that sales office and you don't have your representation with you, and you say, hey, I want to buy one of your homes, and I went and looked at it, and I really like it, I want to buy one, but I have a realtor, and I want to bring them next time so that they could get their commission. Well, if you don't bring them on the first visit, that builder might not honor that co-broke. Now, the reason that they want you to have representation, because if you go in there without a realtor and you say, I want to buy one of your homes, do you think that builder's going to represent you or themselves? They're representing themselves. That's it. So if you go in there without representation, you could buy one of their homes, and you're not going to be able to buy it for a cheaper price if you don't have representation. So you're better off bringing somebody so that you are represented. But if you didn't bring somebody, that builder's only going to represent themselves and they're not going to represent you. This is a very similar situation, because the broker has an agency responsibility or an agency relationship with the property owner, not the tenants.
But you can still negotiate with them about the price. You can understand why do I have to have a real estate agent in order for me to negotiate the price?
Well, most new homes, Edwin, you can't negotiate price. Most new homes, the price you see is the price you pay. And why right now can they do that? Because there's demand. Now, Back in 2009, do you think you could have negotiated prices on new homes? Oh, absolutely you could have.
Right now, you can still negotiate like upgrades, like, say, okay, well, price is what it is, but I need irrigation at the minimum or sod in my yard. Because most of those homes, if it's a new tract, we all know, it's just a house, there's no landscaping.
Most builders will give you front yard landscaping as part of their package. Some of them give you front and back. Not many give you front and back, but some do. Maybe as an incentive, they're going to give you front and back. But the point I was trying to make is that when you go into a new home subdivision, if you don't have representation, the builder's not going to represent you. They're only representing and looking out for them. So if you go in there without any representation, don't think the builder's going to look out for your best interest, because they're not. They're only looking out for theirs. And property managers, same thing. Unless there's a dual agency situation where the broker or property manager is going to also represent the tenant and represent the owner. But in most property management cases like that, the property manager is only representing the property owner and not the tenant. Like with you guys, do you guys do residential? Now, if somebody came in or they called and said, hey, we found one of your properties, do you represent the tenant as well or just the owner?
That's a trick question, because we do have leasing agents as well as property managers.
Okay.
So we have them as separate.
Yeah.
But we all work as a team.
But does the property manager represent, like, do you guys get an agency disclosure or relationship form signed with a tenant that says we're going to represent the tenant as well as the property owner?
No, it's the owner.
Yeah. Typically that's the case.
So if you do bring in an agent and a new, they can negotiate prices? Is that what you're saying?
They could. Yeah, they could. I mean, you could submit, if you went into a new home subdivision, Edwin, and the price of the home that you liked was $350,000, and you said, I don't think I want to offer $350,000. I think I want to offer you $300,000. You can. Then chances are the salesperson will tell you, well, if you offer $300,000, the builder's probably not going to accept that, and they might have instructions from the builder that says, we're not looking at any offers less than the list price. And as long as they have that in writing from the builder, if a buyer comes in and says, well, I know the price on that price sheet is $350,000, but I want to offer $300,000, the salesperson could say, we have written instructions from the builder to not submit any offers less than that list price.
So the agent doesn't have any privilege?
Well, they could represent you. They might not be able to negotiate price, but can they make sure that you are not taken advantage of in that purchase contract, and make sure that you have representation when you're doing things like property inspections and walkthroughs, and that if you're using the builder's lender for financing, that they could help you throughout that process. So there's a big advantage to taking a realtor to a new home subdivision, because you as the buyer, you don't pay for that. The builder pays them. And most of the time, you're not going to pay any less for that property if you have representation or if you don't. Because some people think that. Some people think, well, if I go into that new home subdivision and I don't bring my realtor, I'm going to get it for a cheaper price because the builder doesn't have to pay a commission. Those commissions are already built into the price of those homes, because in a lot of neighborhoods, realtors could sell 50, 60 or more percentage of the homes that a builder is offering. So they build those commissions in there and encourage us as realtors to bring buyers in there, because they're more than happy to pay us a commission if we bring them a buyer. The objective of a property manager. Now, the objective, you guys, is always to obtain the highest return for the owner based on the owner's objective. Now, is every owner going to have a different objective? Sure. One owner might say, hey, you know what? My objective is to just generate as much income as I can from that property, and I don't care about doing things like routine or scheduled maintenance. I'm not worried about preserving the long-term value of the property. I just want to generate as much income as I can from that property right now. That could be their objective. And if that's the case, as the property manager, your job is to try to obtain the highest return based on that objective. Now, another owner might say, well, I really don't care about about maximizing revenue right now. I'm more worried about long-term preservation of that property, because I want to keep this for the long run and make sure that in 10, 15 years, that property is going to be worth a lot more than what it's worth right now. And how are we going to do that? By doing things like routine or scheduled maintenance to make sure that we keep up with that routine and scheduled maintenance so that we could preserve the long-term value of that property. That could be their objective. So as the property manager, your job is to make sure that you get the highest return for the owner based on what their objective is. Now, some of the things that property managers need to consider when trying to obtain the highest return for the owner is setting rental rates, considering things like market rates and vacancy factors. So as a property manager, you guys, and again, we'll use the 100-unit apartment complex as an example. If you were the property manager for that 100-unit apartment complex, how as a property manager could you make sure that you're setting rental rates that are not too low and that are not too high? Because if they're too low, your vacancy rates are going to be super low, because all those units are probably going to be rented because they have low rental rates. But if it's too high, your vacancy rates are probably going to be much higher. So how could you come up with a balance? Yeah, check your competition, okay? So like how do you guys determine your rental rates? Yeah, they run comps in the area to see what things are renting for. What have they closed? What are active rentals in those areas? And there's different websites, you guys, you could do that. If you were going to manage your own properties and you said, hey, how do I know what things are renting for in those areas? If you don't have access to things like the MLS, there's lots of websites like rentals.com and AZ Central where people advertise rentals on there, and you could check rental rates based on some of those websites. You can't get as specific or narrow it down as far as a subdivision or a neighborhood, but you could do zip codes. So if you lived in the 85202 zip code and your property was located in there that you were going to rent and you wanted to check rental rates, you could check it based on those zip codes.
So let me ask you, if they do comps, so let's just say the 100 units is $1,000 a month.
Mm-hmm.
But in the surrounding area, it just so happens, very similar, but they're at $1,600 the average between those. And there's a reason, because of the pool, different amenities
Mm-hmm.
offered.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't feel like he needs to do that, so I'm going to cut it back $200 from the max to maximize my income. Is that something that they would establish?
Well, you'd have to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples when you're looking at comparables.
And I understand, so how far would they go out?
Probably no more than a couple of miles, I would imagine, because again, area is going to play a big part. So if you were comparing a similar complex in an older part of town and the same type of a complex in a newer part of town, there might be a big difference in rental rates just because of the location. So you want to try to compare apples to apples, just like you do if you were trying to check comparable sales if you were going to sell a home.
I do a market survey every week. I'm a leasing agent.
Okay.
With competition, so the properties are usually graded. So we're a B property.
Okay.
And so I call about 6 of them every week, and we do the report to the owners and the managers.
Okay.
That helps them stabilize a good price. And if we're leasing quickly, we'll raise the price.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
If we vacant for a while, then we're going to.
Right. Then you might say, hey, these have been vacant for maybe a couple of months, so we're going to try to drop the rent because we'd rather get a little bit less just to get that unit occupied. So you wouldn't compare, if yours was a B property, you wouldn't be comparing yours with an A or a C property. You want to compare them with other similar B properties. Now, how far, and that might answer Stephen's question, how far out will you go to find other B properties?
We would stay in the same vicinity, so we would do same area code. There's a couple that are the area.
Zip code or area code?
Zip code.
Okay,
Zip code,
okay,
yes. Zip code.
Okay.
There's some that are the zip code next to it.
okay.
John, as an example, my girlfriend, she's leasing a condo there 4 years, and their rent is, not bad. But now, everybody that's been moving out, they've been coming in, putting in subway tiling all over in the kitchen, stainless steel appliances, just totally changing it from where it was, upgraded significantly.
And probably up in the rent too, sure.
So,
Because rental rates have definitely increased over the last 5 years. Oh yeah, rental rates have increased significantly over the last 5 years for residential.
if somebody advertises and says they have pool, spa, jacuzzi, and it's in the advertisement, and they don't supply the spa because something had happened with a younger, like a child,
Mm-hmm.
burned or sucked down through the drain or something like that.
Yeah.
And you move in, because this happened to her, we moved in one night, we went out to go use the spa, sit inside, they got the button and everything there to put the timer, but nothing. Well, it turned out all the electrical wires, the conduit, everything was gone and missing. This was, a couple of weeks after she moved in.
I have one even better. I have a rental property that my wife and I own over in Mesa, and we put it up for sale, and the current tenant that's in there now, his lease expires at the end of April. So we talked to him and said, hey, look, if we help you find something else, would you be willing to break your lease early if we find a buyer that wants to own or occupy it before the end of your lease? And he said, sure. So we were out looking, we were showing him rentals one day, and my wife pulled one up and sent it to him, and he's like, oh yeah, I really like this one. My kids like it because it has a pool. We get there, there's no pool in the backyard. We're like, I'm looking at the picture, I'm like, this house has a pool. There's a picture with a pool and a diving board. They filled it in. The pool was filled in. So we called up, the tenant ended up not liking it anyway because of the location and what it backed to, but I asked the listing agent, I said, you know that you're misrepresenting that property. I said, your photos that you have in MLS show that the property has a pool. You identify in the listing that it has a pool when in fact it doesn't. And their response was, well, I didn't know that. And I said, well, you mean to tell me you took a listing on something and you have pictures of it with a pool, and then when you go to the property there is no pool? I said, you don't know that? I mean that was something that where they were absolutely misrepresenting that property.
See, with Lynn, it turns out that the spa is attached to the pool.
Yeah.
It's a bigger, like 10-man spa, so there's water in it and everything. The light turns on at night, but it's non-functional, But it's still, even to this day, on the flyer sheet, it will say pool, spa. Pool,
Now,
spa.
it could. Now, does it say heated spa? Yeah, or working spa. No, that I mean we laugh about that, but you could advertise it.
Spa, it's just basically a pool, a little pool, because there is no jets that are functioning.
It's smaller, so it has to be designated as a spa.
So,
It's a child's wading pool, but also,
I mean, and that's one thing is, how is that going to be interpreted? Somebody might look at that and say, a spa, they immediately think, well, it's a heated spa, when in fact it might not be. I mean, and it doesn't sound like it was ever disclosed to her that that spa was not in working condition.
what do you think? Because you like the
Yeah.
location and everything. Like I say, all the knobs are there and everything, but
There's also the small print as is.
Yeah, something like that I think is misleading. Selecting quality tenants. What are some of the things as a property manager, you guys, you could do to try to minimize your risk of getting a bad tenant? Yeah, background checks. What kind of background checks? Criminal background checks? How about credit background checks? Yeah, you want to do those too, because when you look at someone's credit report, and don't just look at one credit bureau either. Look at a credit bureau that has all three of their credit files in there, because all creditors don't report to the same credit bureaus. So you might have a tenant, and if you only get a credit report from, say, Experian, that they may have creditors that they have defaulted to that don't report to Experian, but they report to TransUnion and Equifax. But you didn't get that credit file. So when you do background checks, I always recommend, if you're going to do a credit background check, get what they call a tri-merged credit report that has all three of the bureaus.
Years ago, we didn't do the car business. Medical, cable, those are things were overlooked. The main primary ones were repo, skipping, rental agency. Those were the big ones.
Yeah, because does a credit report show a person's creditworthiness? Yeah, it sure does. That's what they're designed for. It basically will give a picture of your fiscal responsibility, doesn't it? Because if you yeah, I mean, and a lot of credit reports have erroneous information, and that's why it's so important to monitor those.
Natural person, what place on the website we should check the credit report?
Who should check a credit report?
Like a personal, no company, like a natural person. Yes, if I don't have a company, if I rental.
If you were just an individual property owner, yeah, there's lots of places online that you could get those reports. There's places you could go online that you could spend $30 to $50 and get a credit and a criminal background check on somebody. And you could have the tenant pay for that. If you have a good rental application, in that rental application, when they sign that, they're giving you permission to do a credit and criminal background check, and you could collect a fee for that as part of an application fee. Like, how much do you guys charge an application fee? How much is it? And does that include their background checks? Okay. Collecting and depositing rents. So who's going to be collecting rents and where are those rents going to be deposited? Establishing and enforcing rules. Now, one other thing with establishing and enforcing rules, you guys, you want to make sure that any rules that you have apply equally to everybody. So again, if this was the 100-unit apartment complex, you want to make sure that any rules that you have, that the rules apply equally to everybody, not just one group of people. And you know what, you guys, I see that light blinking on that camera. I want to make sure that the battery isn't going to die. Okay. Maintaining good tenant relations. Maintaining good tenant relations, you guys, what is that going to allow a property manager to do when you maintain good relationships with the tenants? Yeah, you might keep tenants longer. If you're a property manager that has a poor relationship with the tenants as far as things like communicating, maintenance requests, those types of things, tenants might say, you know what, my lease is coming up. I don't think I want to sign another lease because we just don't have really good communication with the property manager. Anytime we have any maintenance requests, we have to ask them like 5 or 6 times to repair something instead of just asking them once. So maintaining good tenant relations is going to give you as the property manager the opportunity to keep tenants longer and also to hopefully have your tenants go out and promote your property so that you get new tenants. Maintaining the property and services. Hiring employees or contracting for services. So again, you guys, based on what the owner's objective is it going to be more cost effective as a property manager if you're doing things like maintenance, to hire your own maintenance staff, or is it going to be more cost effective for you to go out and contract the work? So that's something that you'd have to look at. You have to try to decide, is it more cost effective to hire my own people or contract out? Right, sure. And then 8, no kickbacks from suppliers of goods and services. So we go back to that item under Roman numeral 3, you guys, property managers can't make a secret profit from the owner, because remember, the property manager, they have a fiduciary responsibility to who? To the owner, which means they have to put the owner's best interest first. And by making a profit on the owner and not disclosing that to them would be violating your fiduciary responsibilities. Okay, any questions, you guys, on anything from Lesson 2 before we move on to the Landlord-Tenant Act? No? Okay. So Lesson 3 is the Residential Landlord-Tenant Act. And in Canvas, you guys, I put a copy of the entire 2015 Arizona Residential Landlord-Tenant Act, and I think it's about 33 or 34 pages. So there's copies of that in there. But the only stuff that you're going to be responsible for testing purposes will be what we have in the book. So why do we have the Landlord-Tenant Act? To try to simplify and clarify the rights and duties of landlords and tenants. Because as a landlord, do you want to know what your rights are? Yeah, as a tenant, do you want to know what your rights are? Absolutely, and that's why we have landlord-tenant laws, so that it's designed to simplify and clarify the rights and duties of landlords and tenants. There are 4 basic sets of statutes that govern landlord-tenant relationships in Arizona. We have the Arizona Residential Landlord-Tenant Act, the Arizona Mobile Home Park Residential Landlord-Tenant Act, the Recreational Vehicle Long-Term Space Act, and the Commercial Landlord Statutes, which apply to commercial rental property. Now, the majority of what we're going to cover, you guys, is A, the Residential Landlord-Tenant Act. We're not going to touch on B and C at all. We'll touch on a few of the commercial landlord-tenant statutes, but the rules that apply to commercial property are significantly different than what that apply to residential. So Article 1, Statute 33-1302. Now remember, you guys, you will not be responsible for any of those statute numbers, okay? I know I refer to them, but you will not be responsible for those on any quizzes or exams. So what is the purpose of the Landlord-Tenant Act? We talked about to simplify, clarify, and modernize the laws governing residential property. So it's going to tell the landlords or show the landlords what laws apply and how do those laws benefit them. How do landlord-tenant laws benefit the tenant? Now, how many of you guys have actually looked through the Landlord-Tenant Act before? Yeah? Who do you think, I mean, in your opinion, who do you think it benefits more, the landlord or the tenant? You do? I would say that I believe that it kind of protects the landlords more than it does the tenants. I think, anyway. Now, again, everybody has their opinion as far as what they think, but I think that some of the statutes that we have really protect the landlord, especially when it comes to things like eviction. And I know in some states it's a lot harder and it takes a lot more time to evict a tenant than it does here in Arizona. 33-1308, what are exclusions or what is not going to apply to the Residential Landlord-Tenant Act? Any residence at an institution, whether it's public or private, if it's incidental to detention, the provision of medical, educational, counseling, or religious services, or the provision of a social service program that's provided by a social service provided. So any residence that an institution or public or private. So if you were incarcerated, would that be governed by landlord-tenant laws? You think? No, that would not be covered under landlord-tenant laws. What if you were in the hospital? Would that be covered by landlord-tenant laws? No, it wouldn't be. If you sign a lease agreement, it could be governed by landlord-tenant laws. So what if you were in a fraternity or a sorority house at a college? Would that be governed by landlord-tenant laws? No, those are not governed by landlord-tenant laws. If you look at number 2, member of a fraternal or social organization in the portion of a structure operated for the benefit of that organization. So those types of organizations or properties are not going to be governed by landlord-tenant laws. Article 2, 33-1901, slum properties. Now, what do you think a slum property is, you guys? A what? Maybe it could be, but it's dealing more with if somebody is occupying the property. So a slum property is going to be a property that is not maintained in a habitable condition. Okay? So do landlords have responsibilities to maintain a property to habitable standards? Yes, they sure do. And that's what the slum statute goes into. And it talks about what are the responsibilities of a landlord and do they have to maintain those properties in a habitable condition. 33-13-19, bed bug control. So is a landlord responsible, you guys, to disclose if a property has ever had or currently has bed bugs? Yes, it sure does. So if you look at those, number 1, the landlord shall provide bed bug educational material to new and existing tenants. I think that's a good idea, you guys. Even if you have a property that you've never had problems with bed bugs, I would probably get some information and give that to tenants in the event that there's ever bed bugs on the property. 2, the landlord shall not enter into any lease agreement with a tenant for a dwelling unit that the landlord knows to have a current bed bug infestation. So if the landlord knows that that property currently contains bed bugs, they're not permitted to enter into any kind of a lease agreement with a tenant. 3, the tenant shall not knowingly move materials into a unit that are infested with bed bugs. A tenant who knows of the presence of bed bugs shall provide the landlord written or electronic notification. So what if you as a landlord, you lease a property to a tenant and 3 months later a tenant sends you a notification that says, oh, we just discovered that the property has bed bugs? Who's responsible to remediate those? Yeah, owner is. Like, what do you guys have any kind of like a bed bug addendum that you have tenants sign? And how do you determine that? Like if you had a tenant that called up and said, hey, you know what? I think that this unit has bed bugs. How do you guys determine were those bed bugs present at the time of that lease agreement, or was it something that the tenants brought in there? How do you verify that?
If there's people in there, so we have a maintenance company that's a sister company, and so they go through and they clean the property before tenants come in, and so they would be able to see if there was any, because they're notified that that's something that they need to look for, just like mold or something along those lines. And so if they don't see it, then it's up to the property manager's discretion to figure out it.
Yeah, I mean, you could even have that. You could even have a pest control company come in and verify when that unit is vacant. Hey, we've done an inspection and it doesn't contain any bed bugs. That's right. So it's really hard as a property owner to be able to prove who brought those in. But more times than not, who's going to be the one that pays to remediate? They could come in all kinds of ways. I mean, you could clothing. They could come in from, yeah, they could come in. Let's say that you went to a hotel, and that hotel.
I understand all where do they come, they just don't in thin air pop out. I mean, are they coming off a plant or, I mean?
And two, they multiply rapidly. Bed bugs, yeah, they do. They multiply rapidly. So it's, I mean, I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen one before, but if you ever just do a Google search and type in bed bugs and click images, you'll see them. They're kind of creepy looking. And I mean, I don't care how nice of a place that you ever stay at, you should probably always check. And where you want to check is that part of the mattress where there's seams in there. That's where you normally want to look to see if there's any bed bugs. You could stay at a 5-star resort and there could be bed bugs there. You never know. And how do you remediate? Like, how do you guys do remediation? Do you know? Well, like if there was a unit that you were managing that had them, do you know what they do for remediation?
There's only a few ways that
Yeah.
bleach is one, and you have to wash everything with bleach, or you freeze it.
Or no, heat. So a lot of what a lot of pest control companies do to remediate is they bring in these heaters that get, I think it's over 125 degrees, or could be even higher than that. So they bring in these heaters, and that's what will kill the bed bugs. It could do that too. So it could be something that. Oh no.
So when I did a move-out inspection a few months ago, that they were infested. Every room had bed bugs.
Oh.
So I had booties, the little like hospital booties on my feet, and I was trying not to touch anything in the house. And so they were upstairs, they were downstairs, they were absolutely everywhere, and there was furniture throughout the entire house.
I know from pest control companies that I spoke with, they normally will say that the best type of remediation is when it's heat. Did somebody have a hand up out there that I saw? Oh, yeah, it can be. Yeah, it's more and more of a problem.
I thought it was like borax and borax together.
I don't know. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. 331321 security deposits. Remember last week, you guys, we talked about what's the maximum amount that a landlord could demand as a security deposit? 1.5 times a month's rent. So if a tenant was paying $1,000 a month, what's the maximum amount of a security deposit that the landlord could demand? $1,500. Now that includes prepaid rent. So if the landlord said, well, we're going to collect first month's, which is not prepaid, but we're going to collect last month's of $1,000, now what's the maximum amount of a security deposit that they could collect? $500, okay? I'm more of a proponent of collecting a larger security deposit than prepaid rent, because if they skip out on their lease, you could keep that security deposit. But if they fulfill the term of the lease and there's more than $500 worth of damages, now you as a landlord or property manager would have to go after that tenant in a court action to try to collect that security. So I would always rather take a larger security deposit than prepaid rent. Because again, if they skip out on that lease, you could keep that security deposit. I would always rather have more security in the event that there's damages than collect prepaid rent. Now, could a tenant, could they volunteer to pay more than 1.5 times a month's rent? Yeah. What if the tenant had really bad credit, but they said, we'll pay you 6 months worth of rent in advance of $6,000, and we'll give you the security deposit of 1.5 times. If the tenant volunteers that, can the landlord accept it? They could, but they just can't demand that. Now remember, the security deposit has to be held as refundable. Now refundable doesn't mean that they're going to get it back. It means that if the property is returned to its original condition and there's no damages, that would be what would be refunded back to the tenant. But if there's damages, could a landlord take damages out of there? They can. And let's say that a tenant fulfills the term of their lease agreement, and let's say when you do your walkthrough, you determine that there's damages.
Under the normal wear.
Yeah, let's say that there was paint, carpet, and drywall. Let's say the paint was 200, the carpet was 200, and the drywall was 100. So you had total damages of $500. So if the tenant fulfills the term of that lease agreement, how long, we said, does the landlord have to get that security deposit back to the tenant? 14 business days, and they'd have to give them a list of these itemized deductions. So what would be the amount that would be due back to the tenant? Would it be $1,500? No, it would be $1,000. So it would be $1,500 less the $500. So the amount refunded back to them would be $1,000. And remember, we said if the landlord doesn't return that to the tenant within 14 business days, what's the tenant's remedy? Twice the amount wrongfully withheld. So what would be the amount wrongfully withheld? Would it be $2,000 or $3,000? $2,000, because this would be the amount wrongfully withheld.
So do you have to provide a receipt for those damages? Like, get inspected, you have to provide a receipt?
Yeah, or some sort of an invoice or an estimate for those. Yeah, because what if they move out and you did your walkthrough and you determined that there was damages? You called up either handyman or a contractor to come over, and they gave you a bid. And this was the bid that the contractor gave you to come in and repair those items. That's what you would want to provide to the tenant.
What if the windows that are in the house or in the apartment are a little bit older and we have a roof dust on it? And that dust comes through the windows and gets all over, like into the carpeting, onto the walls. Would the tenant still be liable at that point if there's like significant, like you have a window?
Yeah, because how do you determine where that came from?
Well, there could be openings inside the window.
What if that window was open? How do you determine that? I don't know. That'd be kind of hard to, if the tenant said, well, it's because they're old single pane windows and air comes in from the top and the sides of those windows. So when that dust storm came in, all that dust came in through those cracks in the windows. I don't know how you would be able to prove that. I think that might be kind of tough. But who knows? It could happen. 33:13:23, possession. At the commencement of the term, the landlord shall deliver possession of the premises to the tenant in compliance with the landlord. So if your lease commences on 1/1 of 2017, when does the landlord have to deliver possession? On or before that date. And if they deliver it to him after that date, could the landlord still collect a full month's rent, or would they have to prorate? They'd have to prorate. 33:13:24, landlord to maintain fit premises. Landlord to comply with all the requirements of applicable building codes that materially affect the health and safety. And they have to make all repairs and do whatever is necessary to keep the property in a fit and habitable condition. Same thing with the tenants, though. So does the tenant have the responsibility to maintain that according to building codes and safety, health and safety, I should say? Sure, and to maintain it in a fit and habitable condition.
If something's broken in the apartment and they don't come and fix it, then you say, no, that's the way it's supposed to work. But I have a refrigerator that never worked, and I've been there 11 months.
Mm-hmm.
And they say they put in a little machine that says that it works, but I was throwing away all my food. I had to go and buy a refrigerator myself
Really?
because that one doesn't work, and they say they're not going to fix it because according to the machine it works, and I'm throwing away I was throwing away my food.
Wow.
Still sitting there, I don't use it, but I'm paying electricity for both of them.
Yeah, and I guess you'd have to determine how are they deciding whether or not that is functional or not? What kind of gauge are they using to determine whether or not that refrigerator is adequate or not? Yeah. Or the person that's doing the test, are they certified?
Right, and I mean, if they're saying that they're doing it, how can I prove it that it's not? I mean,
Should get a technician to come out and look at it.
Yeah, that's what I would have suggested is I would probably get somebody to come out that is a licensed appliance repair and have them come out and test it. Yeah, that maybe specializes in refrigeration. I think that'd be a good idea, because then you could show that to the property manager or landlord and say, look, I had somebody come out and verify that this is not in working condition based on standards.
So possibly returning of the expenses that you made for not only the food, but as well as the technician going out there.
Yeah.
And they'll get it now.
I've been there 11 months, but can I still do it now and maybe charge them for one half? Because you let them know what's wrong with the refrigerator.
I don't know. I mean, could you say, well, could I go back and collect could that be retroactive? I don't know. That'd probably be up to a court to decide.
Documented several notices and they failed to, remedy.
Again, that would probably be something that a court would have to decide on.
Well, I'm living in a month, so.
331331, notice of foreclosure. So as a property owner or manager, you guys, if that property is currently in foreclosure, is that something that you would have to disclose to a potential tenant? Yes, you would. And why would you have to disclose that, do you think? Well, they might not own it after that property goes to foreclosure, because foreclosure is just a time from when a trustee sale notice is recorded till the time that it's auctioned off. So once that property is auctioned off, that current owner may no longer own that property, and a tenant might have to leave before that lease expires, depending on who buys it and what is their intention. So anytime that a property is in foreclosure, the landlord, if they know that the property is in foreclosure, that has to be disclosed.
Does the owner have to comply with the current lease though? Or
We'll talk about that right now. So what if the property is in foreclosure? What if you are leasing a property and all of a sudden you come home one day and there's a foreclosure notice on your door, and you say, hey, wait a minute, I've been paying my rent to the landlord, but the landlord's not making the mortgage payments on the house. If the trustee sale notice was 30 days away, then once that property goes to an auction, then whoever buys it, the current owner, no longer owns the property. So what happens to that lease agreement? Do the tenants just get kicked out? No, we have something that's called the Protecting Tenants at Foreclosure Act of 2009, which that expired and it has been renewed. And if you flip over to page 103, letter under HR 33 or HR 1334, the Permanently Protecting Tenants at Foreclosure Act. So that original legislation expired and it became permanent in 2015. And this is basically what it says, that a property, it must first have a bona fide lease agreement. So what is a bona fide lease agreement? That's a lease or tenancy is bona fide if the tenant is not the mortgagor or the parent, spouse, or child of the mortgagor. The lease or tenancy is the result of an arm's length transaction, and the lease or tenancy requires that the rent is not substantially lower than fair market value. So in other words, you guys, what is considered a bona fide or a real lease agreement? So if you were the owner of the property, you were the mortgagor, okay, could you lease that property to yourself And if it goes to foreclosure, still be protected under this act if you were the owner? No. Or what if it was somebody that was related to you, which is where it talks about spouse, child of the mortgagor. So could you lease that property to your kids? And if it goes to foreclosure, be protected? No, because that's not a bona fide lease agreement. What if you knew that that property was in foreclosure, you leased it, and you gave the tenant a substantial market reduction in rent because you knew that the property was in foreclosure? Would that be bona fide? No, it would not. So if that if that lease is deemed to be bona fide, then what a court's going to do is going to look at it, and under number 3, the requirements, under the new law, the immediate successor in interest at foreclosure must A, provide bona fide tenants with a 90-day notice prior to eviction, and B, allow bona fide tenants with leases to occupy the property until the end of the lease term, except the lease can be terminated with 90 days notice if the unit is sold to a purchaser who will occupy the property. So if you as an investor bought that property at a foreclosure sale and you were buying it and planning on moving into it as an owner occupant, if the property had a tenant in it and that lease was bona fide, how long of a notice would you have to give that tenant before they can be evicted? 90 days. Now, what if you're buying that property as an investor and you have no intentions to own or occupy it? Then what happens? Then whatever that lease term is, you as the new owner would have to honor that lease agreement. So if a bank takes that property back at a foreclosure and it has a bona fide lease, what does the bank have to do? Do they have to honor that lease agreement? They do, because they're not buying it and planning on using it as an owner-occupant.
Does that include like maintenance things as well?
Yes, they would be responsible for any maintenance. They would have to honor all the terms and conditions of that lease agreement as long as it's a bona fide lease agreement. Say that again? Whoever the new owner would be. So if it was a bank that took that back at a foreclosure sale, you'd have to either pay it directly to the bank, or if they had a property manager, or if it was an individual investor that bought it, you would have to pay that rent to the investor. Yeah. So it basically protects tenants for properties that went to a foreclosure, so they're not evicted immediately, because there was a lot of that went on between 2008 and 2010. Article 3, tenants' obligations. So like we said, does the tenant have an obligation to maintain that property in a habitable condition just like the landlord? Yes. Do they have to abide by applicable building codes that affect the health and safety of not only that unit but their neighbors as well? Yes, they would.
If they don't, they get the 10-day notice, correct?
They could get a 10-day notice. If it affects the health and safety, that is only a 5-day notice. So what if a tenant had pets on the premises and they never picked up after the pets and that became a health issue? Then how long of a notice would they? 5-day notice at that point. Patrick, did you have a question, or were you just holding up 5? Okay. 331342, rules and regulations. Remember we said rules must promote the convenience, safety, or welfare of all the tenants. They must apply to all the tenants in the premises in a fair and equal manner. And the tenant must have notice of the rules at the time that they enter into that rental agreement. So if there's any rules, you guys, for the apartment complex that you're managing, those 100 units, any rules, whether they're rules by the property manager, whether those are rules that are set by the property owner, if you're managing individual properties and there's CC&Rs recorded against those properties, or bylaws from the homeowners association, all rules have to be given to the prospective tenant at the time that they sign that rental agreement, not after. They have to be given to them before they sign. 331343, access. The tenant shall not unreasonably withhold consent to landlord to enter the dwelling unit in order to inspect the premises or make any repairs. So if the landlord sends a notice to the tenant that says, we need to access the property to make a repair or do an inspection, could the tenant say, absolutely not, you're not entitled to come in and inspect or repair the premises? No, they could not withhold any access. But how long of a notice does the landlord have to give that tenant? 48 hours or 2 days, unless it's an emergency. If it's an emergency, they don't need to give notice. They could just enter the unit. Article 4, remedies. 33-1361, non-compliance by the landlord. So if the landlord is not compliant with the rental agreement, you guys, the tenant would have to give them either a 5-day or a 10-day notice. And like we said, what would be an example of a non-compliance issue that would have to be rectified within 5 days? Anything that affects the health and safety. And what do you think might be an example of that? AC in the summer or heat in the winter, that could be a 5-day notice. What else? Yeah, if there's mold that was growing. Anything that affects health and safety would be a 5-day notice. Everything else would be a 10-day notice. Well, I guess if it affects health and safety, that would be a, if the tenant felt that it was if it was a infestation of roaches, that could affect health safety. Bed bugs, 5-day notice. Yeah, scorpions, that could.
Depend on who signed off on who's taking care of pest control, if it's the owner or the tenant.
Yes.
Isn't that when that kind of comes?
Yes, yeah, because what if the lease agreement showed that it was the tenant's responsibility to take care of all pest control? Yeah. So what if the landlord, you guys, doesn't comply within the 5-day or 10-day notice period? What is the tenant's remedy after that? The constructive eviction. Or remember we said that's when the tenant could go down and file for what we call a forcible detainer action to try to break that lease agreement. 33-1362, failure to deliver possession. So if the landlord fails to deliver possession of the unit, the rent becomes less until that is delivered. So again, let's say that the commencement date was 1/1 of 2015, but the landlord didn't deliver possession until 1/5 of 2017. Could the landlord still demand a full month's rent, or would that have to be prorated? That'd have to be prorated. Yeah, if there's any damages, yeah, absolutely. If there was a walkthrough that was conducted, if there's damages, landlords could still deduct for damages. Yeah, they sure could. 2, if landlord fails to deliver possession, if it's willful and not in good faith, an aggrieved person may recover from the landlord an amount no more than 2 months' periodic rent or twice the actual damages sustained, whichever is greater. So in this example, let's say that the landlord was doing some improvements to the property and the contractors that were doing the work didn't finish it on time, and they didn't finish it until the 5th. And the landlord said, I'm so sorry, that work was supposed to be done by the 1st. It was not. It wasn't completed until the 5th. I'll give you possession on the 5th, and now we have to prorate the rent. That would not be an instance where the landlord is withholding possession, and because it's not willful and in good faith. So, but if the landlord does withhold possession and they're not being willful and they're not doing that in good faith, what is the remedy for the tenant? So what if the landlord just says, you know what? No, I don't think I want to deliver possession until the 10th. Not because that there's any work being done, I just don't want to give you possession until the 10th. That would be an example. So what would be the remedy for the tenant? What could they go after the landlord for? Twice the amount of the damages, which would be 2 months periodic rent, or twice the actual damages, whichever is greater. So if they had to go stay at a hotel and their bill to stay at the hotel for 2 weeks was $2,500 and 2 months rent was $2,000, what would be the amount that the tenant could go after the landlord for? $2,500, because it's 2 months periodic rent or twice the actual damages, whichever is greater. 33-1363, the self-help for minor defects. Remember last week, you guys, we talked about what if the tenant sends the landlord a 10-day notice to make repairs. Landlord doesn't make repairs within the 10-day time frame, and the tenant says, well, I don't want to break the lease because I really enjoy living in this property. I just want the repair made. What is the tenant's remedy? That's the self-help for minor defects. And remember we said the tenant could spend up to $300 or the one half of the monthly rent or $300, whichever amount is greater. So again, if the rent on that unit is $1,000, what's the maximum amount that tenant could spend to have that repair done and still get reimbursed? $500, because that's going to be half a month's rent would be greater than the $300. Now, it absolutely could. If you sent them notices that refrigerator was not working, and they kept coming back and saying, well, we checked and it is working. If you have something that contradicts that from somebody that's licensed, you might be able to collect this. So if the tenant said, I don't want to move out, I just want to fix it, then they could spend up to, they could repair it and spend up to $500. But there's 2 requirements, you guys. The work has to be done by a licensed contractor, and the contractor has to sign a lien waiver. Okay? Now, that lien waiver is something that they sign, and it's saying that the owner is not the one that's paying me for the repair, it's the tenant. And since the owner of the property isn't paying me, I can't go back as the contractor and put a mechanic's lien on the property because the owner didn't pay me, okay? Because who paid them? The tenant did, okay? So those are the 2 requirements. So if the tenant has the work done by a licensed contractor, the contractor signs a waiver of lien, then the tenant could get reimbursed that $500, and if the landlord doesn't reimburse them, they could take it off of their next month's rent. As long as they've sent a copy of the repair, the show that the work was done by somebody licensed, and they send a copy of that lien waiver. If the landlord doesn't reimburse them, they could reduce that from their monthly rent.
If I don't repair the refrigerator, right, because I'm going to leave, I'm going to pay mine, the one that I purchased.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't repair it, can they come back to me on my deposit and say the refrigerator doesn't work now?
No, because you probably have some documentation that shows that they tested it and that it was in working condition.
And that could be applied for bed bugs too?
Oh, this? If it were, yeah. But I mean, for bed bugs, the remediation is kind of expensive. Like, do you have any idea what you guys normally spend?
One room for $500.
Yeah, it's kind of expensive to have those bed bugs remediated, but it's something that has to be done.
Each room is separate, so like living room, bedroom number 2, bathroom. If you wanted all of them done, it would be
You might be looking at thousands of dollars to have the remediation done. Yeah, it might be if they're using the electricity for the unit for those heaters, it could. 33-1366, fire or casualty damage. If the dwelling unit or premises are damaged or destroyed by fire or casualty to an extent that enjoyment is substantially impaired, the tenant may immediately vacate the premises, notify the landlord within 14 days thereafter of their intention to terminate the agreement, and in which case the rental agreement terminates as of the date of vacating. So let's say that the property catches on fire. There was an electrical fire. And let's say that the fire is on April 10th of 2017. And the tenant says, well, this property is not habitable. I can't live in this. I have to vacate immediately. But let's say that they don't notify the landlord until 4/25 that they vacated, okay? So they sent them notice. How long do they have to notify the landlord? They have 14 days. So let's change this to the 24th. So if they sent notice to the landlord on the 24th that they vacated the property, the termination of that tenancy is not going to be the 24th. It's going to go back to the day that they actually vacated, which would be the 10th. 33-13-68, non-compliance by tenant. So same thing, you guys. If the tenant is non-compliant with that rental agreement, the landlord's going to either issue a 5-day or 10-day notice. 5-day notice is going to be for things like non-payment of rent, or if it's a health or safety issue. That would be a 5-day notice. Everything else would be a 10-day notice. So if the tenant doesn't pay their rent, landlord issues a 5-day notice to pay or vacate. If the tenant doesn't comply within 5 days, landlord could go start the actual eviction process, which is filing for the forcible detainer to try to evict the tenants from the unit. Now, if it's something other than non-payment of rent or health-related, then it would be a 10-day notice. Tenant doesn't comply within the 10 days, then landlord could start the actual eviction process. Now, if the landlord is successful, you guys, with evicting a tenant, whether they had to issue a 5-day or 10-day notice, once the tenant has been evicted, and if the landlord regains possession of the property, if there's personal property that's remaining on the premises, the landlord is required to hold that personal property for a period of 21 days beginning on the first day after the writ of restitution or writ of execution is executed. So if the landlord regains possession of the property, they walk in and there's all kinds of the tenant's personal items that are remaining. How long does the landlord have to hold those items before they could dispose of them or sell them? 21 days, okay? And if the landlord incurs any fees for removing that personal property and storing it, the tenant would have to pay those fees before they could recover those personal property belongings. So if the landlord had to call somebody out to remove the personal property and put it in a storage unit, whatever the fees would be to remove the items and store them, the tenant would have to pay those fees before they could collect their personal property.
The tenant not take their possession beforehand.
Why didn't they? I mean, oh God, there could be a number of reasons why they let. Yeah, they.
Or like constable locked them out.
Regardless, yeah, regardless if it was on their, if they just left it behind, or if they were locked out by the constable or the sheriff, whenever the landlord regains possession, they would have to hold that for 21 days. Now,
Are they, sorry,
go ahead.
the owner allowed to let them in and get their possessions if they're feeling nice? Or is that against the
Well, we'll talk about that. 33-13-70, abandonment. So let's say, you guys, that the landlord did not get the rent. Landlord goes over to the property. They notice that it's vacant, okay? If the rent hasn't been paid and there's no personal property on the premises, chances are the tenant's a good indication that the tenant's probably gone, okay? So the landlord could declare that that property is abandoned. So there's two scenarios of when a landlord could determine or identify if that property has been abandoned. The first one, under 33-13-70, the tenant is absent for 7 days, the rent is unpaid, and personal property is left on the premises. That would be one scenario. The second one, the tenant is absent for 5 days, the rent is unpaid, and there is no personal property left on the premises. So either of those scenarios, you guys, the landlord could consider that property to be abandoned. And if it is, then there's a process that they have to go through to declare that property has been abandoned before they could go in and regain possession. So under number 3, if the landlord has identified either number 1 or 2, and they've identified that the property is abandoned, then the landlord has to post a 5-day notice of abandonment, and it has to be posted and mailed to the tenant's last known address, and that property might be the tenant's last known address. And then the landlord may retake possession and re-rent at a fair rental value. So what if the landlord has determined that that property is abandoned, they post the notice of abandonment, they mail a notice to the tenant's last known address. If the tenant does not pay their rent, then after that notice has expired, then the landlord could retake possession and turn around and re-rent it at a fair rental rate.
How the landlord know it is vended if he isn't allowed to get into the house to see if it is there or not?
Well, they could give a 2-day notice. They could send a 48-hour notice to the tenant and say, we're doing a physical inspection of the property. They could look in the windows. They might be able to see inside the property that there's no personal belongings or personal property left. That could give them an indication that it's been abandoned.
Does the neighbor also call in? Would that count as well?
A neighbor calling in and saying, hey, the person living in that property moved out and there's nothing left in there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if,
How you call outside, not just wondering if new people are moving, because that's what happened at my work, is someone called in, hey, we have U-Haul out here, just wondering who the next person is that's moving in, which one of they're just nosy neighbors.
yeah, could be.
And then it was, oh, well, what unit are you talking about?
You know, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that would be evidence enough that the property has been abandoned, or if the landlord would actually have to identify that on their own. Yeah, I mean, if you get a call that says, "Hey, there's a U-Haul here," who's to say? What if they bought some furniture and they were moving it in? So you never know. That doesn't always necessarily mean that they're leaving. Most of the time it does, but. Yeah, that's what we're going to talk about next. Yes. So number 4, if the tenant abandons the unit, the landlord shall make reasonable efforts to re-rent at a fair rental. If the landlord rents the dwelling unit for a term beginning prior to the expiration of the rental agreement, it is deemed to be terminated as of the date that the new tenancy begins. So for your example, if a tenant abandons a property, landlord regains possession. If there's 6 months remaining on that lease agreement, if the landlord retakes possession and they turn around and they rent it 1 month later, can they still go after that previous tenant for the remaining 6 months? No, they could only go after them for the amount of time that that property was vacant. So if the landlord retook possession and they re-rented it 1 month later and the property was only vacant for 30 days, the landlord could only go after that previous tenant for the 30 days it was vacant, not the remaining 5 months because they found a new tenant.
Did I notice that it happened to my daughter's boyfriend's her mother-in-law to me, that he's still paying on that rent for 6 months. They're still taking it as terminated.
Well, they may have taken her to court because they might not have been able to re-rent it. Yeah, they might not have been able to re-rent it. But the rest of this, it says, if the landlord fails to use reasonable efforts to rent the dwelling unit at fair rental, or if the landlord accepts the abandonment as surrender, the rental agreement is deemed to be terminated by the landlord as of the date the landlord has the notice of abandonment. So what if the landlord just says, you know what, I'm not going to try and re-rent that. I'll just stick it to the tenant because they skipped out on me. then their landlord has to make a reasonable effort to try to re-rent that. And if they don't, then that whenever that property was abandoned, if that went to court, then the tenant might come back and say, you know what? They never tried to re-rent that at a fair rental rate. And if that was the case, a judge might say, you know what? I agree with you, tenant. The landlord did not try to re-rent it. And whenever you abandoned it, that's the date that the lease agreement was terminated.
Somebody already moved in, like in an apartment complex.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody already moved back in, and they're still collecting tax rent.
Yeah, that's something that the tenant should probably pursue in court.
How do you define, reasonable effort?
I get that would be up to a court to decide that. I mean, what is reasonable? I mean, did they advertise it? Did they go in and clean it and make it ready for a new tenant? Did they do any sort of advertising to try to advertise that unit to prospective tenants? So I guess that would be up to a court to decide what is reasonable. I would guess, based on my experience, that a landlord would, in order to make reasonable effort, things like cleaning the unit to make sure that it's ready for a new tenant. Was there any advertising that was done? Did they put a sign in front of the property? Did they advertise it in any publications or websites, or hire a property manager to advertise and promote it to try to get a new tenant? If they didn't do any of those things, I wouldn't think that a court would look at that and say that that was a reasonable effort. Number 5, the landlord shall hold the tenant's personal property for a period of 10 days after the landlord's declaration of abandonment. So remember we said, you guys, if a landlord is successful in evicting a tenant, once they regain possession, if there's personal property, how long is a landlord required to hold that personal property? 21 days. But if it's abandoned and the landlord retakes possession and there's personal property, how long do they have to hold it? Only 10 days. So there's a difference whether a landlord is dealing with abandonment or if tenant has been evicted when it comes to holding personal property. Eviction is 21 days. Abandonment is only 10 days. The landlord shall use reasonable care in holding the tenant's personal property. If the landlord holds the personal property for a period and the tenant makes no reasonable effort to recover it, the landlord may sell the property, retain the proceeds, and apply them towards the tenant's outstanding rent or other costs which are covered in the lease agreement. So if the personal property that the landlord finds when they regain possession, what if the value of that personal property was $10,000, landlord or tenant makes no reasonable effort to recover it? After 10 days, the landlord sells it. Can they use the sale of that personal property to pay for the fees that are still owed? They could. Yes. So if the landlord regains possession and they say, oh my God, there's all kinds of personal property here, there's furniture, there's clothing, landlord would have to remove the personal property. If they hired somebody to do it and then put it in a storage unit because they were going to try to re-rent it, whatever fees that were incurred by the landlord to remove it and store it, the tenant would have to pay those before they could collect that personal property. Something like that. Again, what if the landlord said, well, when I went to collect the personal property, that was already cracked. And then the tenant says, well, no, it wasn't. How do you determine that? So, I mean, maybe something that the landlord should do is take pictures or video of that personal property when they regain possession so that they could show what the condition of that is. Because what if that really was cracked and the tenant came back and said, no, that was in good condition when I abandoned the property? Well, the landlord might say, well, you know what? We take photos of the personal property when we regain possession, and in the photo it shows that the screen was cracked. The last part of that paragraph, any excess proceeds may be mailed to the tenant at the tenant's last known address. So if the value of that personal property when it's sold, you guys, is greater than the amount that's owed to the landlord, any excess would have to go back to the tenant and mailed to their last known address. Tenant does not have any rights of access to that property until the actual removal and storage costs have been paid in full, except the tenant may obtain clothing, tools, apparatus, and books of a trade or profession, any identification, financial documents, including those related to the tenant's immigration status, employment status, public assistance, or medical care. So those types of items would have to be returned back to the tenant. The landlord may destroy or otherwise dispose of some or all of the property if the landlord reasonably determines the value is so low that the cost of moving and storing and conducting a public sale exceeds the amount that would be realized from the sale. So if the landlord goes in there and goes, oh my God, the stuff that's left in here is just trash, and if I have to conduct a public auction, the cost to conduct the public auction is going to be greater than the value of the personal property, then at that point that they could dispose of it, as long as they've held it for the minimum of how long if it's been abandoned? 10 days, and if they were evicted, 21 days, that's right. 33-1371, acceptance of partial payments. Landlord is not required to accept a partial payment of rent or other charges. If the landlord does accept partial payment of rent, the landlord still retains the right to proceed against the tenant if the tenant agrees in writing to the terms and conditions of the partial payment. The written agreement shall contain a date in which the balance of the rent is due. So if the tenant calls up the landlord and says, hey, I don't have the full amount of the rent, I only have half of it, can the landlord accept that partial payment and still retain the right to go after the tenant for non-payment of rent? Yes, if the tenant signs an agreement that says the landlord is accepting a partial payment and the tenant agrees to pay the remaining balance of that rent by a specific date. And if they don't pay by that specific date, landlord still retains the right to go after the tenant. Now in other states, if the landlord accepts a partial payment, that's as good as them accepting a full payment.
So when they make partial payment, do they have to pay late fees?
Yes, and that would be part of that agreement. So if the landlord says, I'll accept a partial payment, you have to pay the remaining balance by this date, but you also have to pay the late fees since it's not a full payment. And that too is something that you'd want to put into that written agreement. 33-1372, landlord liens or distraint for rent. That term distraint, you guys, that means that the landlord may not hold personal property for non-payment of rent. So if a tenant doesn't pay their rent, can the landlord access the property, go in and collect personal property as non-payment? No, they cannot. In Arizona, for residential properties, distraint for rent is not permitted. With commercial property, that's different. If rent on a commercial property is the first, the landlord could lock the tenant out on the second if the rent is not paid, and any personal property in that commercial space would now belong to the landlord. But with residential, that's not the case. 33-1373, remedy after termination. If the rental agreement is terminated, the landlord may have a claim for possession and for rent and a separate claim for actual damages for breach of the rental agreement. So if a tenant, say, skips out on their lease agreement, okay, and the landlord takes them to court for the remainder of the rent, but there's damages that exceed the amount of the security deposit, can the landlord go after the tenant in a separate case for those actual damages that exceed the security? They can. I don't know what the statute of limitations is on that. I'm not sure. I don't know if it's just for the term of the rental agreement. So if there was 6 months remaining, they would have 6 months, or if they still have time after the fact. I'm not sure. 331375, holdover remedies. Remember we said, you guys, what if a tenant occupies the property after the lease agreement expires? Remember what we called that? We called it a holdover tenant or a tenancy at sufferance, okay? Now, what is the amount of time that either a landlord or a tenant has to give if they're going to terminate a lease agreement? Well, if it's a week-to-week tenancy, the landlord or the tenant would have to give a 10-day written notice prior to the termination date specified. And if it's a month-to-month tenancy, the landlord or the tenant has to give a 30-day notice prior to the periodic rental due date. So if you're in a month-to-month lease and you plan on terminating that lease on April 30th of 2017, as the landlord or the tenant, when would you have to give notice to the landlord or the tenant? If rent is due on the first, if rent is due on the first day of the month, then when would you have to give notice? The last day of the previous month. So either you'd have to do it by March 30th or before. And then all notices, you guys, whether it's a notice to terminate by the landlord or the tenant, those notices have to be in writing. Bless you. The commercial landlord-tenant statutes, these statutes don't apply in situations where the Residential Act applies or the Mobile Home Act applies. So if it's something that is not governed by residential or the Mobile Home Landlord-Tenant Act, then commercial statutes might apply. A, the commercial landlord-tenant statutes apply only if the Residential or Mobile Home Act does not apply. B, the commercial statutes are state law and apply everywhere in the state of Arizona, not outside of the boundaries of our state. C, a rental agreement is not required unless the lease agreement is for more than 1 year. So that's similar to the Residential Landlord-Tenant Act, isn't it, you guys? Remember when we talked about the statute of frauds where all real estate contracts have to be in writing to be enforceable except a lease for 1 year or less or a broker to broker. Security deposits, there's no restriction or maximum on the amount that is allowed to be demanded by a landlord for commercial properties. Because remember, for residential, you guys, what's the maximum amount that a landlord could demand? 1.5 times. With commercial, there is no maximum.
There's only minimum for commercial.
There is no maximum that is allowed. So if a landlord says, well, I want 5 months of a security deposit versus 1.5 times, there's no maximum amount. There's no 5-day notice for non-payment of rent with commercial. So if your rent is due on the first, you guys, the landlord doesn't have to give you a 5-day notice and then go through an actual eviction process. They could lock you out on the second. And if any personal property that's left in there, guess who it now belongs to? It would belong to the landlord. And then F, distraint for non-payment of rent is permissible in Arizona with commercial, which we just talked about. So if a landlord locks a tenant out on the second for non-payment of rent, who does all that personal property now belongs to who? To the landlord. So could the landlord accept that as non-payment of rent? They can. So distraint for rent with residential is not permitted, but it is permissible with commercial. Okay, any questions, you guys, on anything from lessons 2 and 3? Yes?
Quick question. So say, in the agreement, you put down, $200 for, non-refundable for payment. And then, by the time we get out, it's not more than that, do you start to know that, or you have to pay him that specific number you put in there?
For residential? Now, if you held that as is non-refundable, then the tenant's not getting that back whether it's clean or not. Now, if the amount to clean it, because it was so dirty, exceeds the amount of, it depends on what you have in your rental agreement, because some lease agreements will state that any refundable deposit cannot include a cleaning deposit. So you'd have to keep a separate fee. So if it didn't, if your lease agreement said the non-refundable security deposit does not include, cannot include a cleaning fee, then the only fee that you could keep from them would be that non-refundable deposit. And if it cost you more to clean it, then the landlord at that point would be out of luck. So that's why you might want to include a cleaning fee, and also state in your lease agreement that if the cost to clean exceeds the amount of the non-refundable deposit, the landlord retains the right to take that out of the non-refundable security deposit. It all depends on how your lease is written.